Hello, curious minds, and welcome to the second episode of the HEAS podcast. I'm your host, Victoria, and I'm happy to be back with yet another episode on human evolution and archaeology. In this episode, we have two incredibly smart and entertaining people who happen to be also brilliant scientists, Andrew Kandel from the University of Tübingen and Gregor Larson from Oxford University. Right after recording with both of them, I was looking forward for you guys to listen to this episode. And I really hope you like it as much as I did, because it was just incredible conversations. And let me tell you a bit about both of them. Andrew is an archaeologist working for the Heidelberg Academy of Sciences, but he's also affiliated with the University of Tübingen in Germany. He specializes in Paleolithic personal ornaments, settlement patterns, and landscape archaeology, just to name a few. Andrew talks about his early inspirations about becoming a scientist growing up in New York, his work in the Caucasus and the Levant, and also he talks about being arrested multiple times in Syria by the secret police during field surveys. He also explains how, when, and where the first personal ornaments were produced by our ancestors. The way Andrew walks you through these stories with his very calming voice makes it a real pleasant listen, almost like an archaeological story time. Now let's move on to Gregor. Gregor Larson is an evolutionary geneticist and an expert in animal domestication. So usually what I do is I listen to the talk of our guest speaker, and then after we sit down and record our podcast together. In this specific case, however, we recorded the day before, so right after when Gregor arrived, and I hadn't listened to the talk yet, so I was not aware what's going to go down and what Gregor is going to say during that talk. If I would have attended the talk before, I would have put together a completely different interview. That's why when Gregor and I sat down, I metaphorically threw the script out of the window. And you can basically feel me struggle. I didn't know where to go with this interview because it was made to revolve around domestication, which is his field of expertise, right? See and listen for yourselves. During Gregor's talk, the day after, Tom, Chaim, and Gregor performed a song. I'm not kidding. Here's the evidence. But let me tell you about our interview. Gregor is questioning everything, including his own previous research and the current understanding of domestication. He proceeded to tell me that on his way here, he was actually thinking about putting a paper together with the name, what was it? The Case Against Domestication. Gregor and I went on a tangent about how intentional domestication is probably not a thing. We moved on talking about grumpy cats, how everybody, including Buzz Aldrin, has imposter syndrome, and just so much more. And with that, I'll leave you to the episode, and I really hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Welcome to the HEAS podcast. Andrew Kandel, welcome to the HEAS podcast.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Before we dive into the interview, could you give us a little introduction to yourself and your scientific field?
Sure. Well, I'm a native New Yorker, so I grew up, born and raised, and I left the city when I was 18 to go to university, studied geology and oceanography, and then ended up working in Los Angeles for a long time in the field of geology and environment before I restarted my academic career, moving to Germany in 1995. And I did my PhD in Germany as well, in Tübingen. And now I'm working for the Heidelberg Academy of Sciences and Humanities, but as a researcher in Tübingen, affiliated with the university.
And how was that for you to kind of change your type of career and to start over again? I guess the fields are quite related, right? And it benefited you, but it's like a big deal.
Yeah, actually, it was not a big deal to me. I really welcomed the opportunity, one, to have a normal working career, non-academic, because it allowed me to see how things function, right? You have responsibilities that are much different. You have to deal with clients. You have to deal with management and all sorts of things, which in the end really helped me in my further career. So the things that I learned as a consultant in geology and environment were really useful because I could do a project, complete a project. I knew how to integrate a team, lots of different aspects. I knew how to manage the finances because of the requirement that I had to do that as a consultant. So they turned out to be really good things. And probably the biggest thing I learned was you had to get the report to the client the next day sometimes, and you can't worry if it's perfect. And in academia, so when I switched to academia, obviously it was much different, but I still took those elements of what was important to apply to my academic career as well. So I can actually get a report done quickly.
That is amazing and definitely a skill that is useful in academia. And also your financial skills that you acquired during your time there are definitely helpful, as I can imagine, because you have to manage a project. For the people that don't know, you have to really see how you distribute your finances during an academical project, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that comes in handy.
Exactly.
So would you define yourself as an archaeologist now?
Yeah, totally, actually.
Okay.
So, I mean, in the beginning, I was a geologist, and that's what I studied. I thought I was going to be a marine biologist.
Me too.
Like Jacques Cousteau, who was my role model when I was growing up. The undersea world of Jacques Cousteau was really one of my favorite things. And I grew up a block away from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And I had a membership card as a kid, and so I could go there whenever I wanted to. So I really had a very strong inkling that I was going to work in some kind of a natural science. And that was the best thing about being a kid in New York, was just being able to walk there and to go in anytime I wanted to look at the halls of evolution, to look at the mammals, to look at everything that they offer there. It was really cool.
I can really imagine that that shapes you. And did you become a diver then as well?
How did you know?
Because I did. That's what I did.
Yeah. When I was 12, I want to say, my dad took me somewhere where we could learn diving, and I learned how to dive. And I actually did it a lot when I was younger, which got me into the oceanography, of course.
That's really cool because myself, I did it at the age of 12 as well.
Oh.
But then taking the test, they told me, oh, wait, I'm looking at your test now, but you're not 16 yet. And I'm like, yeah. He was like, well, it's not allowed to take that test under the age of 16, but you're already here, so.
Well, I don't know. When I did it, you could definitely be 12.
Could you share with our listeners a bit about your fascinating work in the Levant and the Caucasus?
Sure. Well,
And what drew you to these regions?
That's a good question because people think that you have this drive to go there, but in actuality, it's about who you know and contacts you've created along the way that allow you to work in a place. And I had done my graduate work in South Africa in the field, but I was also working in Germany at a site that was run by the University of Tübingen named Hohlefels, and also another one named Geisenklöstele, managing the labs and running the digs when I was a grad student. And when I started to look for projects of my own after I finished my PhD, I relied on my colleagues who I had become acquainted with to suggest people who were looking for partners to collaborate with. And my first project was really in Syria, together with Nicholas Connard at the University of Tübingen. And we did a 10-year survey and excavation project where we looked for new sites. We found more than 800 sites in the part of Syria north of Damascus, in this beautiful region, sort of in the foothills of the anti-Lebanon mountains. And it really impressed me. I mean, I'd say everything started for me there, gaining that experience. How do you deal with getting partners on the ground, people who are interested in what you're interested in studying, and are able to provide you with background about the local environment, both politically as well as scientifically. So those aspects are really important. Then, unfortunately, with the political events that happened in Syria, I couldn't work there anymore. And so I started looking for other projects. And one of the ones I found was in Armenia, and the other one was in Israel. And that was sort of a double-edged sword, because when I went to Israel, it meant I could never go back to Syria, as far as I know. I think if you've been to Israel, it's very difficult to get a visa to go to Syria, especially now, as you can imagine. So I sort of knew that at that point, I was going to have to make a line. But in general, I was interested in landscape archaeology, which means understanding how people adapted to their environment, to how they dealt with the world around them, where they got water from, where they got rocks to make stone tools, where they got their animals from, how they lived, what they did with plants. And all those things came together in that time and really formed. And I'd say in the end, it was really luck that brought me to the two sites I'm working on now. My partners are great. One is Ronnie Schimmelmitz in the University of Haifa, who I've been working with since 2012. And the other one is Boris Gasparian in Armenia at Yerevan State University and the National Academy of Sciences there, who I've been working with since 2009. So, and I got to know both of them through people I was working with, through collaborators, so scientists who were involved in the other work I was doing, who suggested that I contact these people. And then it always starts with going there, meeting the person, seeing if you get along, because there has to be a good chemistry, a good dynamic between the two partners. Then you have to see if you can get a permit. You also have to see if you can actually find something useful scientifically to work on. And in both cases, I was really lucky. In the case of Armenia, in the Caucasus, I found a site called Akhitu 3 cave, which hadn't been worked on before to a large degree. And so it was a pristine site. In Israel, I surveyed with my partner, Ronnie Schimmelmitz, and we looked at old excavations that maybe wanted a fresh view. And so we found a place called Sfunim Cave, which had been dug in the 40s once, just a test excavation, which is really a probe to see if there's something there. And there was, by a guy named Stekeles. Then in the 60s, by a researcher from Haifa named Avram Ronen, who dug the site of Sfunim. And we continued then in the 2000s and 2010s especially, and 20s, to continue the work that was done before us, building on that, using modern techniques, things that weren't available 40 or 60 or 80 years ago, to better understand how people survived, how they lived, how they adapted in their environments.
You made a couple of very important points here, but I think the most outstanding one is that you have to have a good communication and collaboration with the people from the countries, right?
Yeah.
So that's how you get to the sites, as you said, you get the permissions, and it's really good to also, stay in contact and communicate the results. That's what I've been dealing with, like I'm doing a PhD in ancient DNA, and that's what I've experienced. And I'm also, interestingly, working with Boris. And yeah, we actually have a paper in review together at the moment, so he's been super nice and really helpful. So
that's great.
You've mentioned that you're also doing landscape archaeology. And for those unfamiliar with maybe archaeology in general, how would you describe a typical day in the field? Like, what does a landscape or generally an archaeologist do? And what do you do on a daily basis on excavation?
That's a tricky question because there's two aspects that we do. So first of all is what we call survey, where we prospection. We try to find new sites and we walk around the landscape. We basically go on really nice hikes up the mountains, down the mountains, along the edges of cliffs, looking for caves, looking for places where people might have stopped in the past. And we sort of use our archaeologist minds to try to understand where might people have preferred to live in the past. What parts of the landscape attracted them? Was it a place where two valleys come together? That would be useful for maybe overlooking where animals are going, where enemies are coming from, other people who are around that you may not know, to sort of a strategic position in a sense. So we use the survey as a way to find new sites. then the next step, once you've found potential sites, and we usually do like a very small pit just to see, are there sediments? Does the geology of the area look like there can be a sequence of sediments that are trapped, or is it just open where all the sediment gets washed out? Because the sediment is what we need to do a dig, to do an excavation. And without the sediment, there's no remains saved from the past that we can work with. So being a landscape archaeologist means you walk around looking for potential places that people lived, places that were attractive to people, which is oftentimes caves, and then doing the test excavations to see, is there potential here? And then finally deciding, okay, there is potential. Now I'm going to focus my efforts on this one site and excavate it very carefully, the way you imagine Indiana Jones. Now, I would say that's a bad example. He's not a good example at all for excavating carefully, perhaps. He's exciting for sure, but basically we work painstakingly, bucket by bucket, washing, sorting, cataloging, labeling, all the things we find, so that eventually we can give them to the people who are going to study them. And that can include people who look at the stone artifacts that people used, to the animal remains that they left behind. There can be charcoal that people burned, that people analyzed to understand which species people preferred, also which species were available to them in the environment. And there's really a long list of things that we can test to better understand how the human occupation fits with the environment and the climate, and to how people adapted to those conditions.
That's a really good overview for people who might think of Indiana Jones when they're thinking about an archaeologist.
Yeah, I'm sorry I brought it up, actually, because he gets people interested,
right?
As does Laura Croft, but you don't get the impression that they're taking a lot of attention to do things carefully the way we do things.
I think that's the part that people do not realize because it's not that interesting to put it into a movie. You know, the diligence that's behind it, the time it takes to really check if a site is, like, quote unquote, worth digging, really conducting a real huge excavation on it, like the test excavation you mentioned, and everything, also the sieving of the sediment and inventorizing everything. I think that's the part that you do not see.
Yeah, I always say if you want to be an archaeologist, you have to be good at doing the same thing over and over again, because in the end, archaeology is very boring in the sense that it's repetitive, like any job, really. You have to be able to do something. I have to sort thousands of remains and have the patience to do that for days, weeks, months on end. And if you don't have that kind of patience, then it's really, you're not going to go far, unfortunately.
I've been on excavations myself because I wanted to learn and really see where my sediment that I'm analyzing is coming from. So I usually go there if time and everything permits. And I think what you also need is good knees. That's what I've learned.
Good knees for digging is great. Also a good back for carrying things.
Exactly.
And then good eyes for sorting.
Well, I have none of these. That's why I'm very happy that I'm just the anthropologist going there, taking my sediment samples with the help of the archaeologists, and then I can leave.
But it's amazing the world that's opened up. Yeah, the world that's opened up when you're sorting is incredible, because you see the whole universe of the excavation in a microcosm. And in one little, we call it buckets because it's the unit we work in. It's like one bucket. We excavate it, we screen it, then we take away the dirt, either by dry sieving or sometimes wet sieving in water. And then once the material's back in the lab, we sit there and sorting it piece by piece. And you can find little pieces of animal remains. You can find little rocks, chips that people sat there napping. You can find microfauna, which is little animals, mice, voles, hamsters, shrews that lived around the cave that were collected usually by birds of prey that get incorporated into the whole sedimentary assemblage. Really, you can find little beads. You can find ochre, red pigment that people used in the past. You can find fish vertebrae to show that something was accumulating fish. Perhaps people were eating them. There are really so many things that you can find in this thing, but you have to really be open to seeing it, sorting it, and knowing what it is when you find it. But it's extremely exciting. I'd say it's more exciting than the excavation.
I could talk to you for hours about this, but we kind of have to move on to the follower questions.
Sure.
So we go on Instagram and collect questions from our followers, which I'm going to ask you now. First one says, Andrew's work on personal ornaments sounds fascinating. Which objects were commonly used as personal ornaments, and how were they manipulated? For example, drilling holes, etc.
Yeah. So the personal ornaments are one of my favorites. I've worked with them for a long time. In Africa, I worked with ostrich eggshell. People made beads, fashioning them out of pieces of ostrich eggshell. And they drilled a hole in it from one side, then they turned it over and drilled a hole from the other side. Then they rounded the bead. When they were finally able to string them on a string, they could then do a whole chain of them and rub them on a large slab of stone to smooth them out and round them. So that's one kind of ornament that I've personally encountered. Also, we saw how people colored them. They used different treatment techniques. Either, especially burning, was really useful to create color. So you could create gray if you had a low temperature. You could create black if you had a higher temperature. Even under certain conditions, you could create green and blue colors at very high temperature. And you could also create sort of brownish, yellowish, reddish colors by incorporating different materials into the burning mixture. So it was really fascinating just what you could do with ostrich eggshells. Another material that I come across in a lot of my excavations in Israel and in Armenia are shell beads. Shell beads are pretty simple beads in the end. They're not as complicated, for example, as ostrich eggshell because you don't have to form it into an object. You already have a form that you can modify. And with most types of shells, people just put a hole in part of the shell so they could put a string through the shell opening and then pull it through and put another hole to pull it out.
How would they drill the hole?
Well, the drilling happened in many different ways. So one is just by pressure. You could take like a firm stick or even a bone or a rock stone tool, and you could put pressure on it to just break out the hole. That's the simplest way. I would imagine it
could break, right?
They're really fragile. They're really delicate. So people had to know what kind of pressure to use, where's the best place on the shell to do it. Like with a snail shell, a gastropod, which are the spirals, usually people would do it on the outside so that they'd be opposite the other hole that the actual animal used. In bivalves, which are like clams, then they would have a piece, and usually they put a hole either through the center or through what's called the umbo, which is sort of like the protuberance very close to the hinge where the shell connected. And then another way to do it was to drill. So we had perforation just by pressure, but you can also just drill. You can turn an object and move it around, and you can use a combination. You could first put a hole by pressure and then use a drill to smooth out the hole. Another way that people used to perforate shells was rubbing them on a object like sandstone or another rock. And if you keep rubbing and rubbing and rubbing, you eventually smooth it away. And for some shells, if their shape is right, like especially for, I told you about the bivalves, at that umbo, it's actually like a beak. And they protrude. And when you rub it, you can actually make a very nice hole that's very conducive then for stringing. And the funny thing about beads is it implies that people, not only did they collected the shells, they had to collect the tools and make the tools to make the holes. Then they had to collect the materials to make the string that they were going to attach it to either as a necklace or to sew it to a garment. So you needed thread. Then it implies this whole universe of things that grow from this very simple object, right? You might need a needle. You might need other tools as well. You need maybe animal bones. You might need stone tools. All these things are distributed in the landscape. So you have to have a plan. You have to have sort of an idea of how you're going to get all this stuff just to do this simple thing, like make a hole in a shell bead. And I should say, another category, which I don't have at any of my sites, but which is very common, is teeth or bone, but also rock. You can even drill holes in those to make pendants of different shapes, different forms. You can make amulets. You can make sculptures even with a hole on it so that you could string it. There's really a whole array of things that you could use as ornaments.
It might sound so simple, like personal ornament, but actually a lot of thought has to go into that. As you said, planning. So when did the first ornaments appear?
How old are they?
Okay, so that's a really good question. I'd say the first secure ornaments are coming from a site in Northwest Africa in the Maghreb called Bismune. And the shells there are coming from layers that are dated to around 140, 145,000 years old. And starting around that time, you then start to see them proliferate in other regions. So there's this continuation in Northwest Africa. You also see them in the Levant and in Southern Africa. Around maybe 100,000 is a good round number to say. And these numbers, they sound really big, but for us, it's the time when our predecessors, sort of ancient modern humans, were evolving and developing in these places. And it seems to be one of their trademarks, actually. We don't see so much evidence, although there is, for Neanderthals making and using ornaments, but we do see for modern humans a lot of evidence, and it increases over time as well. So by the time you get to 50 or 60,000, in East Africa, you have the proliferation of the ostrich eggshell beads that I mentioned at many, many sites. Mumba in Kapune, Yamoto, Kizese shelter. There's a range of things in Kenya and Tanzania where they have ostrich eggshells. And then by the time you get to the Levant, around 40 or 50,000, you really have shells everywhere. And then you see them also in other places as well. I've seen shells from the sites in Armenia where people wore shell ornaments. I know that there's shells coming from Iran, from all sorts of European sites. Shells become extremely ingrained in the culture of the people who lived at these sites, who were modern humans like us then.
That's really fascinating. And again, I could talk to you for hours about that. I just wanted to mention that there was a paper recently by Essl where they extracted human DNA from a tooth pendant, actually, from the Nisova cave in Siberia, right?
Yes.
So it's really fascinating to me what we can learn from personal ornaments, and that you can extract the DNA of the wearer or the producer of this thing, right? Because the tooth is porous, so that the DNA can go in there and can be extracted by dipping the thing into a buffer that's not doing any damage to it. So it like extracts the DNA from the outer layers. And do you think we could get similar results from other ornaments? I guess it's going to be a problem in Africa due to climate.
Yes. So in Africa, it's more difficult, but it's possible. I mean, it's always worth trying. So one of the hallmarks of that particular study you're talking about is that when the people were excavating the site, they wore masks, they wore outfits, they had gloves on. It's very difficult under normal situations to work like that. But they had a very specific case where they really knew that they had excellent DNA preservation already from previous studies. And so they were being extremely cautious. So when they found the ornament, I believe that they were then able to take it under almost sterile conditions without any contamination by us, because we're the biggest contaminators. If you want to try to look at who made or who wore an ornament in the past, right? Because their DNA is almost infinitesimal. Our DNA is everywhere. It's in our breath, it's in our hair, it's in our skin. It's coming off of us constantly when we breathe. And so it's really important for the excavators to take that into account. And in that particular case, it was really under exceptional circumstances. We've been working on it in Israel at the site called Sfunim, where we've been at least taking samples under as sterile conditions as we can in the hopes that we'll be able to extract some DNA from the people who wore the shell beads. So if we find it, we stop and we immediately scoop it up and sample it with gloves. But we don't wear the protective gear because it's Israel, it's 35 or 40 degrees, and to then be wearing a Tyvek suit with gloves on, we couldn't do the rest of our work. It would be too difficult and too time-consuming, and it's not clear if we could gain anything from it. But we know we have DNA in the sediment. We published that actually a couple of years ago, which was interesting because the Levant is usually not a good place for the preservation of DNA, just like Africa, because of the temperature. The high temperature degrades the organic component of DNA, but also the fluctuating moisture. from dry season to wet season tends to degrade the organic component as well. So those two factors combine to really eliminate DNA from the record. But we have it in Israel between 30 and 70,000 in sediments in low levels. And so because of that indication, we decided it would be worth sampling some objects to see if we could extract DNA from them as well, to find out more about the makers.
I hope you will be able to extract DNA from there. It's so cool.
We'll see what happens.
And the take-home message for any archaeologists listening who want to maybe in the future work with ancient DNA is to pack the things, grab it with like a glove on, put it into a baggie, and don't touch it. And don't wash it. Because before you talked about dry sieving or wet sieving. And if you can, I know it's not always possible, and I'm not an archaeologist, so I don't know what's best, but maybe if you wet sieve, save some ornaments or whatever you want to send for analysis before doing that, if possible. You can maybe just take it out and still wet sieve.
Generally, the ones that we've already wet sieved and found, and honestly, that's the majority of the ornaments. Ornaments are really small for the most part, and we don't always see them when we're doing the normal sorting. Or rather, we don't see them when we're digging. We see them when we're sorting, but to sort them, we have to have washed the sediment, cleaned it, dried it, processed it, and so it has a lot of human contact. And so at that point, like you said, the ornament has been probably contaminated with our own DNA, and then it becomes very difficult to see the needle in the haystack of the ancient DNA that's been overwhelmed by our own DNA.
Yeah, the portion of ancient DNA that we get from sediments is usually very, very low, and it becomes practically impossible. Yes. So the first results that I'm always getting, if there's a positive result for human DNA, my mind always goes to, I've sequenced the archaeologist, which could be the case, you know?
Yeah.
All right.
We should be so lucky as Denisova, but there the environmental conditions are great. It's cold. Yeah. It's actually constant dampness, which is good.
That's great, yeah. All right. Now let's move to a segment called the HEAS Quick Takes. So I'm going to ask you rapid fire questions, and you just answer with the first, what am I saying?
The
third thing that comes to mind, okay?
Sure.
So you skip the first two. No, I'm sorry. The first one, of course.
Okay.
Ready?
I guess so.
Why'd you become a scientist?
Jacques Cousteau.
Right, you've already answered that. What's your biggest motivation?
The fact, one word or a sentence?
You can elaborate.
Okay. The fact that it's really fun to work in all these incredible places with these incredible people, both the local collaborators as well as the colleagues who I get to share the information with and who contribute to the collection of it. Biggest
mess up or incident at work?
Never had any. No.
Good.
No, actually, I've been very fortunate, to be honest. I mean, nothing too bad has gone on. Sometimes there's some mix-ups of samples. I just got a call from a researcher. They forgot to photograph the remains before they did the DNA extraction, and 4 of them may have gotten mixed up. But, you know, we're really careful in the work we do. And so we have descriptions of each object. We have the measurements. We have the weights often. And so you can usually go back. Like there's multiple overlaps of information that we collect. And so even if you lose something very important, like which sample was which, usually we can go back and figure it out.
You have to have a backup information
somewhere. It's just irritating, but it wasn't a huge mess up.
Yeah, I've been there. I had many heart attacks, but then, of course, gladly, we do have several layers of information where you can track back to what the sample actually was.
And maybe just a sub-answer to that would be getting arrested frequently in Syria.
What?
For doing our work, because we were doing survey, walking all over the place, and that's not customary behavior there. And so mostly the police and the secret police called the Muhabarat, they just didn't understand what we were doing.
Yeah.
And we had permits, but they had to then verify the permits. They had to call the people in Damascus to make sure that we were the people we were supposed to be. And so it was always very interesting because we never felt worried about being arrested, which sounds strange, because they would always take care of us. They'd give us tea, they'd give us cookies. We'd just sit around, eat peanuts for a while. And eventually, like 2 hours later, 3 hours later, some of our colleagues, 6 hours later, because he was walking very close to a military base, which he didn't realize,
Oh,
they were freed and there was no problems. So it's again, these are things you don't think about.
I guess you get used to everything, but
Yeah, it was-
becoming
in
a
the end-
scientist, you probably didn't think about getting arrested once.
No, I mean, arrested is, basically
Yeah.
we weren't put in handcuffs. We were treated nicely and respectfully. And it was always interesting, though, because you got sort of an insight into how the system works. So, I mean, that part was fascinating. So I don't know if that's a mess up, but it's sort of a
It's
sub
definitely an
answer.
incident and
Yeah.
not that common, I guess. I mean, I don't know. I have to ask other scientists now.
Customary for
but-
us. We expected
yeah.
it. I mean, we were very close to the border with Lebanon. Everywhere in Syria has some military installation somewhere. So it was inevitable that we would be going somewhere that we didn't realize where there was military. And we always avoided it as best we could, but even then it was very hard not to.
Which book are you currently reading? That seems like a very boring question
No.
after one you just answered, but
I'm reading a book
going with my
by a
script here.
Hungarian author called Se Ibo, There Below. And it's a really interesting story, sort of about the refinement of art and especially the way that artists create things and the thought process that goes into their whole being.
What do you collect?
I try not to collect anything, to be honest. It sounds weird for an archaeologist because I collect a lot of stuff for work. Personally, I try not to collect too much and have a low impact. Nonetheless, I really like fabric.
Fabric.
Yeah, I collect fabrics, textiles, napkins, scarves,
I've
things
never
like that.
heard that before.
I like fabric. My father was in textiles. Maybe it's from that.
Oh, that could be. Very interesting. If you had to switch professions, what would you do?
Retire.
That's so honest, and I love it. What's a secret talent of yours?
I can touch my tongue to the tip of my nose.
Wow. I'm not sure if I should ask you. Tom is trying to do it.
I'm hoping you won't,
All right.
I'll do that.
Amazing.
but I can.
What's one of the best pieces of advice you've received?
Yeah, I mean, to try to do what you love doing if you can. And if you can't, then to try to love it anyway.
I like
For
that.
personal satisfaction, I'd say. I mean, we as archaeologists are really lucky because we have a pretty fun career that takes us places and we experience a lot of things. And I'm fortunate that that I took this path and it ended up being successful.
What's something you've always wanted to try but never ended up doing?
Skydiving.
I asked my husband this exact question that morning, and that was my answer to that question.
Okay.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, because I
Alright,
think
are
it'd be
you
like
gonna-
diving, right? I mean, there's something related, like skydiving and scuba diving are somehow you're floating above everything.
Are you going to do it?
I don't know. I'm a little afraid.
I think we should do it. Let me know if you've done it, and
Let's
then
go. I did
All right,
do a balloon
podcast
once.
is over, bye.
I did do a balloon once. And that was close to skydiving, I guess. The idea of floating.
did you say balloon?
Yeah, ballooning.
Ballooning. That's
Yeah,
what it's
yeah,
called.
like-
I didn't know it in English. Yeah, I did that too. It was cool, but I would have loved to jump with some security, of course, not like just jump. All right.
Yeah, there was no jumping in this case.
Okay, now let's move to our segment called Speakers Ask Speakers, where every guest leaves a question for another speaker. And I have a lovely one for you today. What was the most fascinating moment of your research career?
I would say it was probably, well, there's two. There's one of them, well, from my own research career, was the discovery of a eyed sewing needle at the site in Armenia called Achitu. And the reason for that is because it's a really rare find. And it literally is the needle in the haystack. And one of the excavators, who happened to be from Iran, who was a student in Tübingen, came to me while he was sorting and said, I found this and I think I have an eyed bone needle. And I said, oh my gosh, it's really true. He went ahead and tried to replicate it. He got a bone from the butcher, and then he made some stone tools, and he carved a bone. And it took him, I want to say it took him not continuously, but maybe 8 or 10 hours to do. So it's a lot of work. He already had the stone tools, so he didn't have to make them, but he carved
I was going to ask,
the bone
he didn't make
and
the
then
stone tools.
drilled the hole in it to make a needle. And it was the exact same size and proportions of the needle we found. And so we used that as an inference that people were sewing, making clothing of some kind, probably compound or composite clothes, not just like a cape you put over your shoulders, but really something that was tailored, a garment that you could use a fine needle. I mean, it's the same size as modern needles, basically, that are made out of metal. And you could probably sew anything with it.
And did you analyze that needle further? So do you know how old it is, or maybe some more information about it?
We know that the layer it came from is about 28,000 to 29,000 years ago. And that makes it one of the oldest and most securely dated needles that we know about. Most of the needles we know about start around 40,000 years ago. And really, in the period from like 40,000 to 30,000 plus or minus, you've got about 9 sites in Asia and nowhere else in the world where we have evidence of this kind of technology. So it's really a rare find.
What an amazing find.
Yeah.
That probably also was one of the coolest moments in that student's career so far, I guess. I mean, I would
had
be
a lot of good moments, but
lucky
he was a very
guy.
he was a very good excavator and very careful. So
Amazing. So to wrap this up, I'm going to ask you if you want to be found online, could you provide your social media handles, or where can people find you?
I
Online.
don't have any social media handles per se, but our project, the role of culture in early expansions of humans, which is abbreviated ROCEEH, ROCEEH, has websites. And there you can find out about the research I'm doing. I'm pretty easy to find also just through the University of Tübingen or through the ROCEEH homepage. So if people want to contact me directly, I guess I'd be happy to answer any further questions they might have.
Andrew, it was a pleasure to be talking to you today. Thank you for sitting down with us for the HEAS podcast.
I thank you. It was actually really fun.
Hello, Gregor, and welcome to the HEAS podcast. Before we delve into our discussion, we'd like to give our listeners a chance to get to know you a bit better. So could you please share a brief introduction about yourself and your work?
Sure. Well, firstly, it's great to be here. Thank you very much. I'm just fresh off the plane and the train and the tram, and it's very exciting. A little bit about me. I didn't come into academia very quickly. I took a couple of years after undergraduate, did a bunch of other stuff, and then was reading around and just thought, I'm just interested. I'm just curious about the natural world, and it just seemed like academia sounded like a fun thing. But I really never intended to get into research. And then I started finding some stuff out during my PhD that was just super exciting, and I just thought, wow, I just want to keep doing this. I mean, there's jobs out there that pay people to just pure evolutionary biology in the sense that it was the natural world doing natural world things, which is fascinating. what it allowed for was a human component, which then made it had then additional elements of things like culture and anthropology, and then how the interaction between people and plants and animals sort of manifested into the modern world. And that was always very appealing to me.
My next question is going to be, a lot of your research revolves around domestication of wild animals, as you said. Can you explain how scientists study or identify signs of domestication in the genome of animals, or where else can you see domestication?
That's a really good question. I'm at the point of my career, I think this probably happens to everybody at some point, where you get really interested in something. And then a couple of decades later, as you're studying it, you realize that it's all predicated on a bunch of, I don't want to say nonsense, but you start to kind of, you start to question things that you took for granted early on. And then you begin to realize that maybe everything that you've ever studied or known or thought you knew, it doesn't exist. Like, it's just all this kind of, it's a lot of words and a lot of speculation about things and a lot of assumed truths, but none of it really has any basis in reality or in empirical evidence. So, which is a long way of saying, yeah, I'm kind of questioning everything at this point. I'm not even sure that domestication exists. I was just thinking about a paper on the way here that I got invited to a conference, and they're like, oh, we'd love a title. And I was like, I'm thinking about calling it The Case Against Domestication, because I think that everybody knows, they feel, they have an intuition. Everybody's like, I know what that is. I have a dog, I have a cat, I've got a pet turtle, whatever. I eat chicken, those are domesticated, clearly. But beyond that superficial intuition, what is it? What is the unifying thread that links the pet turtle to the dog, to the chicken, to the millet, to the grain? I don't know. I think that we've spent a long time looking for those links. And I'm not saying they don't exist, but I'm not sure that they're nearly as strong as people have assumed. In other words, the grand narrative of domestication doesn't really seem to hold much water for me. I mean, which is, of course, that a couple of smart people 10, 12,000 years ago, usually in the Near East, decide just that they look around and go, oh, what would be a really good idea here? Let's grab some crops. We don't even know, we're going to call them crops once we've done this to them. We're going to grab them, we're going to plant them in a specific place. We're going to then select them for things that we want. So we're going to make the rachis really brittle so that we can shake it and that we're going to also select for size. We're going to make that big. And then we're going to go out, we're going to grab a bunch of wild animals and we're going to tether them to a stick in the village. Well, first maybe just outside, then in the village. And then, we want some companionship too, so let's get a couple of dogs. And those cats are kind of cute. Plus, they keep the rats away and the mice away, who are after the grain that we're now storing because we had to grow it. So, let's grab a couple of those too. And then voila, what have you got? You've got an entire suite of domestic plants and animals that are all very much integrated with each other, but all at the core of human intention, human desire. And that, of course, is the basis for what we now believe to be a far superior, far more intelligent way of living, which is most of us don't have to do that stuff. Whereas prior to that, most people were involved in some way, shape, or form in the acquisition of the protein off the landscape in order to continue to survive. So, and that all makes sense. It all is like, well, yeah, but it's all told from the present, where we want to believe that. We want to think of ourselves as superior. We want to believe that we have some sort of thing that makes us special and different over everything else, and that we actively did all these things, because if it was all by accident, well, then what does that mean about our place in the universe? And it gets all weird and sketchy. So I just don't, and a lot of people, it's not just me, a lot of people have been questioning that narrative for a long time, and there's been a lot of alternative ways to perceive it, but it still seems to hold sway, especially amongst people who don't think about domestication, but even some who do. So I'm just feeling kind of punchy. Maybe it was the altitude that I was just at for a couple hours. I don't know.
Maybe we should have given you a little break before diving into that energy strain.
Maybe. I'm just getting kind of off I was going off into some tangent right now. But I think that there are, and the other part about my career thus far is that I keep being embarrassed myself, because I believe things, or I tell people things like, don't believe this. And then I hear a story and it sounds really attractive and I believe it without even questioning it. And then as soon as I start to investigate, or somebody else investigates it, I go, oh, actually, no, why did I believe that in the first place? So it's more, this is my own ennui. This is my own sort of not feeling so great about myself because of my inability to fail to see the untruths that are ever present within the field of domestication, probably evolutionary biology, and probably academia writ large. We are all holding on to these ideas that are there, and it's only a matter of time before there's a paradigm shift and everything turns over. It's just, while you're in it, it feels like it's true, because it has to be. I gave a talk in China almost about a decade ago in Xi'an, where the whole premise of the talk was, I just went through a series of not my entire career by that point, but a lot of it, where I said, publish this paper and everything about it was wrong, and publish this paper and everything about it was wrong. And I had quite a few people come up to me afterward going, wow, that was amazing. I was like, oh, well, thank you. It was fun to put the talk together. Like, no, not necessarily the content of the talk, but just the fact you were willing to admit you were wrong. And I was like, but that's the point here, you see, because otherwise it's just not fun for me, right? The whole point is that you're always questioning what you think you know, and that's what's driving the curiosity, and that's what makes this job worthwhile.
I thought it was just refreshing to hear that from you, because not every scientist you sit down with and you ask them about their work is, that's not the first thing they will dive into. So I thought it was really, really cool that you started it that way. But also at the same time, I thought, actually my whole interview revolves around domestication and all my questions. So what am I going to ask you now if you don't believe in it?
No, it's not that I don't believe in it. It's just, what I would be interested to see when you start asking me the questions is how many of those questions are predicated upon an assumption which has yet to be questioned by the people who are asking that question. That's going to be fun. We'll do that.
As you elaborated, I was like, okay, we can still do that.
Absolutely.
Okay, so tomorrow you're actually going to give a talk at our department that specifically focuses on the domestication of cats.
That's right.
Can you tell us more about how and when cats became one of our best friends?
Some cats are people's best friends. Many cats are not so much. So we are in the process of questioning that too. The most common narrative with cats is you have a bunch of people in the Near East who start entering into an agricultural way of life where they are sedentary and they are growing grain as the primary means of their survival. So when you grow grain and you start operating like that, you then probably grow too much to be able to eat all in one go. Plus, it's nice to have something for when the climate's not so great for growing, because now you're tied to an annual season. So you then develop grain stores where you take the grain and you put it into a place. Well, the grain stores, that's a whole lot of really good stuff that a lot of other organisms would be very tempted by, including rodents, rats and mice and probably birds and all kinds of other things that are if you don't kind of actually nail down that store, that's a magnet for a whole lot of things. So these videos that I've seen on YouTube that show grain silos, and I think one of them was in Australia, and somehow a couple of mice got in at some point, and then somebody realized it and then opened a latch at the bottom of it, and then there was just this flood, this absolute just deluge of mice that just came pouring out of it. So yeah, one mouse is cute, a million mice not so much, right? So there is,
especially not in your food storage.
Precisely, right? That's problematic. Right. And this it's recurrent, right? If you have a whole lot of grain in one place, that acts as a massive magnet to a whole bunch of different things, because there's a whole ton of protein there to be consumed and digested. I mean, who's going to pass that up? So then the idea then is, if you've got all the rodents that are being attracted to the grain stores, then the cats that are around are then being attracted to the rodents, because you're increasing the number of rodents there. So that acts as a magnet. So that what it's often commonly spun as is that whereas dogs and people form a relationship between the two of them, or wolves and people that then become dogs, cats are there as an adjacent accidental byproduct of the fact that you've got grain storage, and then you've got mice, and then you've got cats. And so there is this slightly more tangential, slightly more distant relationship between the two.
So it's not an intentional domestication in that sense, is it?
Well, right.
Maybe
so
after
my line is, I don't think such a thing exists. I've yet to see any evidence for one that where people deliberately went out and said, we're going to domesticate this. That was the verb they had in their head. That's what they wanted to do. And they created a population of sustained, multi-generational change that was consistent with or indicative of domestication. I don't think that that's what happens. And there's all kinds of evidence to the contrary of that. But exactly that, right? That's the kind of thing that we all think. In fact, there are people who have published on this, calling it that's the directed pathway, where people have the idea, we have dogs, so we know how to do it, so we're going to go out and grab this donkey. I don't see that that's ever... The thing for me is that is so often assumed that nobody bothers to test it, and nobody bothers to look for the evidence. In fact, in my talk tomorrow, I'm going to show two examples where in published papers, it says something about how like substantial evidence demonstrates that, but there's no citation. And when you actually look for that evidence, it doesn't exist. And it's exactly the same thing for domestic cats with that narrative that I've just told you. It's a sound narrative. It works really well. It makes a lot of sense. You've got grain, you've got mice, you've got cats, everything flows. The only problem with that is that there's no evidence for it. What you have is a cat from 9,500 years ago on Cyprus in a burial with a woman who's also buried. The relationship between the two is assumed, but hasn't really been shown with a radiocarbon date because it's a different cut. So the cat is likely to be, but may not be. It hasn't really been demonstrated. It's on Cyprus. So the argument is that people move the cat from either the Levant or somewhere on the continental coast because Cyprus was never connected to the continent. And if you're moving the animal, you've got a relationship with it. So therefore you've got, and that ties in neatly with, just after the kind of grain thing in the Near East and the settled agricultural revolution and all that sort of stuff. The only problem is that for 4,000 years after that, there's no cats. So if it was a big thing, then where are the cats after that? And you could say, oh, well, they are predators. And in predators, therefore, you find many fewer of them than herbivores on a site where zooarchaeologically you'd find a lot of sheep, goat, and cow, but you're not going to find so many dogs. So therefore, you're probably not going to find very many cats, which is a little bit of an argument that suggests that our lack of evidence is then evidence for it, when in fact, if there are any cats around, if there's that many mice chasing that much stored grain, there should be some cats around. And for at least 4,000 years, there are not. And all the ones that have been claimed appear on a second amount of going back over the actual evidence to be wild cats. They're not domestic cats. So So we did the paper last year about chickens where people were claiming the same thing for chickens at 10,000, 9,000 years ago. And our evidence is suggesting it's more like 3.5. And we're doing the same thing for cats right now. It looks like everybody says 9, 10,000 for cats. Nope, not really seeing anything till 3.5. So we love the story so much that we never bother to check whether they're true or not.
As you said, I think we might also give ourselves a little too much credit for the act of intentional domestication, because probably it was a process and then we saw the benefits and ran with it.
Or they just became part of the furniture, right? In
or
many
that.
cases. So an example of that. So, and this is, claiming that everybody needs to have evidence for everything they say. I've heard this anecdotally from somebody else recently, which is that there is this assumption one of the assumptions in which dogs come in and people and wolves start hanging out and you get this dogs is that dogs are beneficial as hunters. So that we can partner up. They've got pace, they've got smell, we have weapons, there's ways in which, you team up and you can take down bigger things and then share them. Mm-hmm. And a lot of anthropologists and ethnographers have looked at modern groups that have used dogs to hunt. And I'm not saying that there's no benefit in this, but several of the studies apparently that I've heard about have looked to see whether or not the dogs are actually more successful. And then they do a proper analysis of where they ask the people questionnaires and they come up with all these kinds of ways to try and assess to what degree and to what proportion is the presence of a dog assisting with or generating a larger number of kills, a larger amount of protein coming out of the forest or off the landscape or whatever it is. And what it looks like is that the dog, I'm not saying they don't, but more often than not, the people are like, oh, we just kind of like having them around. It's not like even that they're providing more just somebody to hang out with and who enjoys it rather than this very strict, the way often we look at in the past is by how much protein and what units of this per unit of time that you could be doing, what's the opportunity cost, and it's all very functional and it's all very much like this has to be optimized in some way, the kind of optimal foraging theory. And I think most of culture is just like, oh well, it looked good, or it was kind of fun, or it was just kind of nice. And I don't know how much we as individuals have optimized our lives, so why would we necessarily expect our ancestors to have done the same with respect to what happened to be around and what they were doing at the time? And I don't know. I just kind of like the idea that people are like, oh yeah, that's kind of fun. They're just around. Because that's what we do all the time, right? And there's no reason that their behavior and our behavior should be any different.
It's so interesting that you're mentioning that, because when I asked my mom the question about why do you think we domesticated cats, she was like, well, that's easy because they're cute. And I was like, no, Mom, actually, there's more of, a thought process behind that and whatever a scientist would say, But actually, now talking to you, I have to go back to my mom and tell her what you said and apologize.
Well, and it's not even that like we domesticated them, right? That again assumes this kind of top-down, we go out. But the cuteness thing is absolutely a big deal. I mean, look how many cats are on the internet precisely for that reason. In fact, I was just on a website last night looking at all the internet cats and how many followers they have, and it's just ridiculous. But it's also a bit... And this is where, it gets turned on its head again. You want to be able to celebrate it and laugh, and I go, ah, ha, ha. You know Grumpy Cat. Are you familiar?
Of course.
Of course. Everybody knows Grumpy Cat, right? Grumpy Cat, unfortunately, has passed away, right? But Grumpy Cat, for a very long time, has had many, many followers. You know why Grumpy Cat looks the way that Grumpy Cat does?
No.
Because Grumpy Cat had dwarfism and an underbite. So what we're doing is we're looking at what this cat was and equating a pathology with cuteness and celebrating it, even though this cat was not it was not a fully developed
It didn't look well.
But it looked funny, and it made some really great jokes. But we're celebrating the pathology, which I just think, what's the equivalent in humans? I mean, that's got a pretty sketchy history, right? So... I don't know. It's almost like everything. This is why we can't have nice things, because I come along and I think of these things, and I go off and I look on the internet and I'm like, oh, geez, I love Grumpy Cat. And then I read that and it kind of made me go, oh, maybe we shouldn't be putting cats like that on I don't know. It's just a bit sketchy.
I completely agree with that. We shouldn't, sometimes we should really refrain from doing certain things. I was going to ask you about that. I do have a pug, but it's secondhand, so I adopted it.
Was it refurbished?
No. I mean, it had quite a couple of surgeries to, make it work, quote unquote.
Right.
But that's I always say it's like an evolutionary, it's like an ending, a man-made, because it shouldn't exist the way it exists. And maybe we should have just left the wolves alone,
Yeah, I mean, we have done things with animals and with plants in the last 150 years.
Oh, yeah.
That have, the common refrain that I've been saying recently is that a lot of this is a post-World War II phenomenon, and a kind of the industrialization and then the fetishization of plants and animals to the point where, and it's been around for a long time, but it's gone through this threshold where in just the last 50 to 60 years, chickens are now 3 times the size at the same age that they were. Turkeys have doubled in size, and milk production in cows has tripled as well. So that's a whole lot of change over a very short period of time when you consider the entire temporal continuum of when these animals and people first started hanging out together. And you look at strawberries or blueberries or pumpkins or any number of other plants as well, which are now just, radical bastardizations. I mean, they're horror movies when you think about what their wild progenitors were. And it's just insane.
That's true. Also, if you look at corn, have you ever, the wild form of corn, our listeners should Google that, because it doesn't have anything to do with the corn you think of.
Right. No, it's
insane.
Yep. We've pushed and pulled. I mean, there is it's a phenomenal experiment in that way from an evolutionary perspective, which is one thing that's kind of enjoyable about it, because you can, the shape and the size and the form of these things, when tweaked and pulled and pushed by people, can just take on these monstrous proportions, which is really pretty amazing when you consider how none of that variability is really explored through any processes that don't involve people.
Yeah. That's true. We've taken it very far. But also we have to feed a lot of people when you think about,
We do, but in so doing, we just need to feed more people, right? I mean, it's an interesting cyclical thing. Like, if your argument is that you have to have a huge amount of protein to feed a burgeoning population, what you are then doing is creating an even more burgeoning population, which then demands more food. So it becomes this very rapid positive feedback cycle, which, we're already at 8 billion. What does the Earth look like at 15 billion or 60? I don't know, but it's a reasonably scary prospect given everything that's been going extinct and the whole way in which the planet has been, the trajectory of the planet over the last couple of centuries at least, if not well before that.
Right. And we don't know. We haven't explored what the limits of our planets are.
Well, we're doing that. We're doing that now.
We're pushing it, right?
Yeah,
it's kind of scary to think about that.
It really is. It really is.
So at this point, I would like to move into the follow-up questions.
Sure.
But as I'm now looking through them, I think you answered almost everything already. And also, now that we're looking at this from a different angle, domestication as a whole, I think we're going to skip the first 2 and just ask you if the domestication of cats and dogs occurred in the same part of the world.
Right. Good question. Great question. That assumes that we know where this process took place, and we don't. Certainly for dogs. The issue with dogs is that we know that dogs come from wolves, but wolves are a pain in the ass because they have existed as a wild species from Portugal to New England, right? So you're spanning 2 full continents and the whole circumnavigating the Earth effectively in the northern latitudes. And so there's a lot of variability and has been for a couple 100,000 years at least. So that's a very large pool from which to then take a population that then gets closer to people that ends up being dogs. And despite a huge amount of effort by a whole lot of people for a very long time, I don't know that we are any closer to identifying where this process or which population of wolves it was that led to dogs. We are kind of, if I had to guess at this point, I would say northeastern Eurasia, but a lot of people would think that I'm crazy for saying that, or that also presupposes that there's just once. And it's also possible with some of the ancient genomics that's coming out where it looks like there's an East Asian component, writ very large, and a Western Eurasian component, also writ kind of large. And so whether those 2 populations were completely independent or not, or whether it was emerging later of dogs that came from one place and then moved, or came independently and then got together, it's just hard to say. So dogs, we don't really know. Cats, we know that cats come from Felis libica, which is the North African wildcat. And that distribution is sort of that band of North Africa along the Mediterranean, flowing a little bit further south through the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, a little bit of Sudan, and then up into Anatolia. So it's a much more restricted region, and historically and prehistorically as well. But even within that, it's difficult to say. I'm the new evidence that's coming out, I'm kind of trending more toward something a lot more recent and something a lot more North African than either Anatolian or Levantine, but yeah, who knows? I'm not afraid to tell you that after 20 years of doing this, we are really not much closer.
And are there any animals that cannot be domesticated?
No. Yeah,
you can pour yourself water. Don't worry. Just
that's a classic question. Again, the assumption for that is that this is an intentional thing that people are trying to do, and that either success or failure by you have your pug, or you have canonically your gazelle, which people tried desperately to domesticate, but then couldn't because they were not capable of this. Diamond put this forward as it kind of got a lot of traction. It wasn't just him, but early 2000s he had a Nature paper where he talked about animals that could or could not, but it was built off a lot of research prior to that as well. And it also presupposes that we know what domestication means. You can pretty much tame anything. I've got a colleague, Naomi Sykes, who has this hypothesis, which is I think it's got a lot of credibility, which is that everything is food motivated. And if you have, a bit like the mice and the grain storage, a bit like reindeer and salt licks, a bit like zoos where you can get even very fierce big tigers to do ridiculous things. If you just give them a clicker and then a high value treat, they will roll over and allow you to put a needle into them to take some blood. Like they'll actively put their arm out. So you can get animals to do all kinds of things simply by providing them with a huge amount of food. So I don't know. I mean, if that's domestication, by just having them hang out with you more, looking for food, then I'm not sure there's an animal on Earth that wouldn't like a whole lot of whatever it is their favorite fruit or food just provided to them by us. That'll be fine.
That's a good theory, actually. I understand that. I would do a lot for good food too. But
we all would, right? Like, who's going to turn that down?
It's a great motivator. Let's put it that way.
And it changes behavior in a massive way, right? So there's huge numbers of examples of birds that will fly long distances to go places in the winter, unless there's a huge amount of food available to them in the summer, in which case they're like, why are we going to go there? We just kind of hang out here. And you can disrupt all kinds of behavior just by providing a food resource and incentive. And it works every time.
I would love to continue to ask you a bunch of questions now that I know like your viewpoint on domestication. It's really, really interesting. I didn't expect that. But we have to move on to our HEAS quick takes.
Ooh, lightning round.
Are you a cat or a dog person?
Both. I mean, why not, right? Like, why deny yourself a soft, fuzzy tummy, regardless of which animal you're talking about?
I like that answer. Some people don't like either, so.
That's true, fair enough. Well, maybe allergies play a role in that, too. I completely get that.
Well, there's pills for that.
Oh, I see. And now we're making cats that are and dogs that don't upset the allergens or don't possess the allergens that upset people. So sure.
Worst comment you ever received from a reviewer?
Oh, geez, there's so many to choose from. I had one once that I made my Twitter description, but then I took it down because I thought if that person read it, then that it was, I think it was something like, this article is biologically mildly interesting and archaeologically fairly irrelevant, which was like, okay, thanks for that very cutting and very incisive, but very helpful comment. We now know how to make the manuscript better, asshole, right? This is like, I mean, how, it just, I don't know. I can see the temptation. Everybody's short of time. Everybody gets frustrated when they're reading a paper that doesn't, fit with their expectation, or they just, something pops up that just makes them not feel very good. And it's very, very easy in an anonymous context, late at night with a Word document in front of you, just to say something, just put it out there. And what I'm saying is, yeah, think it, write it, but just don't send it to me. There's no upside here. I'm not going to benefit from that comment. And you're just going to be angry for a while.
There's no benefit in that. And that's why the internet is such a dangerous place.
Exactly, which is why
you can't be anonymous.
No, that's a bad idea.
Favorite archaeological site you visited?
So here's the thing. I'm in an archaeology department, but if I refer to myself as an archaeologist, all my archaeologist colleagues will just kind of roll their eyes or raise an eyebrow or sort of just give me that look, which is like, don't say that you're an archaeologist. I'm not. I have been to a handful of sites, and I was lucky enough to go to Çatalhöyük about a little over a decade ago, and that was amazing. You see it on television and you hear the stories, but to actually be there and see all the layers and then see all the finds as they're coming out and hear the stories from the archaeologists about what they're finding in the floorboards and the bucrania and all, oh my God, yeah, it was.
Can you explain for our listeners a bit where that is?
So
and what
it is it's on the Konya Plain in Turkey, in southwest Turkey. And it is one of the it's huge, and it's an early Neolithic site, and they have all of these houses that were basically built kind of on top of each other. So it ends up being this giant tell, this huge mound that is, I think, something like 40 or 50 meters high. I don't think I'm exaggerating with that. And it's taken them decades to excavate it. And you can actually see, because it's houses, and there's people who are living in there, and the things that they were doing where they're burying people under the floorboards and they're putting up these skulls of cattle up very prominently on the walls, and then they didn't come outside of a house like we do. They came up through the roof. So there's ladder spaces where you come up to the top, and then it's just, have your listeners Google just the artist impressions of what that site looked like when it was in full flow, and it's spectacular.
If you could go back to the beginning of your studies, would you do it all over again?
Yeah, I really would. It's just been such a thrill ride. And you know what it is for me? And we haven't really touched upon this, but there is that discovery element, but that sounds very solo. And I don't want to give your listeners the impression that that's like the thing that most compels me to do this. What I find, and a lot of my colleagues felt the same way post-COVID, was that it's just so social. I'm here because of Tom Hyam today. Like, I could be at a lot of other European universities or not be, because I wouldn't get an invitation. But Tom and I are old friends, and we go way back, and we enjoy each other's company. And he's like, why don't you come down? Because he's moved to Vienna relatively recently. He's like, well, we'll get you on the seminar list, and we'll pay for your flight, and you can come down and give a talk. And I was like, that sounds great. But that's not happening in a vacuum. That's happening within the context of a deep, personal, fun, friendly relationship. And that's, for me, the best thing about academia, is that there are so many people whose company I absolutely enjoy, and I only met them because we're all fascinated by the natural world, and we all have this approach to how we go about doing things, and it's just fun. And I've met some just absolutely amazing people. And what I love is that you go to a conference and you get blown away, like completely smashed to smithereens. Your ego just becomes dust because everybody else is kicking your ass nonstop, and everybody feels that way, right? Everybody knows that they're just basically incompetent relative to all of their peers, but they're fun to hang out with and get a beer. So you keep going, right? So you dispense with the insecurity and with feeling like what's the phrase when you don't feel like you can?
Imposter syndrome.
Imposter syndrome. Just get rid of that.
I know that because I feel it every day.
Everybody does, though. Everybody does.
Is that true?
Absolutely.
Is that true? Because
Absolutely.
when I'm at a conference, I feel like maybe I shouldn't be here.
Oh no! First couple of years of going to conferences, I would come away with it going, like shaking with fear because everybody was just kicking my ass left, right, and center. So there's this classic story where there was a woman who was invited invited to a thing, and she was standing with a bunch of people, and there was a guy who was like, oh, geez, I don't know if I should be here. There's so many eminent people here. This is really kind of, it's an august group, and I'm not sure I belong. Turned out it was Buzz Aldrin, right? And her line was like, if Buzz Aldrin's got imposter syndrome, then everybody's got imposter syndrome, right? He's been on the moon, for Christ's sake. Come on.
Oh my God.
So I think that
it's universal.
Yeah,
Right.
you get a thick skin through the reviews. You enjoy just being with other human beings who have a like-minded approach to the way in which they see the world and the fascination of it, and how they go about trying to generate data and think about things and put things together. And you just end up having a huge blast. And I would say that, by this stage, I absolutely love the research, but I don't want to prioritize the research over the people who are in this, in just kind of academia writ large. I just love it. It's great.
I love that you just said that, because for me, it also plays a big role. And it's also one of the reasons I even, started this podcast, because you get to sit down with so many fascinating researchers on the one side, but you're also meeting great people. You're having fun. You get to talk to these people, maybe even after the podcast, and then you establish like acquaintances. And when you meet again, you're like, oh, remember that time? Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely.
It's also
I couldn't agree more.
It's about networking, and I really love that aspect of academia as well.
And what I think too is that you'll find, maybe not all, perhaps not all, maybe my sample set is biased here, but I think a lot of academics are kind of deeply silly. I think you kind of have to be, to sort of, firstly to even know that this job exists, right? We get paid money to be curious about the natural world and to try and investigate it through creative means. And the only way you can do that is by kind of questioning everything and then just being just a bit ridiculous about stuff. Because the best ideas and the most interesting takes and the most interesting connections don't come logically. They often just come from an accident or happenstance or a weird thing that somebody said that reminded you of something, and you're like, wait, you do that? Oh, you found that? Whoa, wow, this is amazing. And a lot of projects that I've spoken to friends of mine that they've done, some of their most fun projects have just been like really ridiculous things, like just completely out of left field, just have nothing to do with anything practical or anything else, but are just deeply silly. And those are a lot more fun.
The last question I'm going to ask you is actually one of our guests left this question for you. I think you've already touched upon it in one of the stories. But the question is, what is your most favorite discovery in the field or lab so far? Your own.
My own. Well, so firstly, and this is what I always do, is I question the question. I think for as much as the Nobel Prize is given out to like one people, okay, maybe 3 people maximum, right? But they've got a cap. Science is at its best and at its heart collaborative. And so there's nothing that I've ever done that hasn't been just come from a huge number of people having discussions and a lot of hard work from a whole lot of people doing lots of different things. And then, if you're around long enough, you can take solo credit for it, but it wasn't you, right?
Yeah.
There was one thing that this did happen where it was the two of us. In 2015, a postdoc of mine who's now a very senior, important professor guy named Laurent Franz, we got a genome of an ancient dog from Dan Bradley because and this is the whole thing, it's all accident. He'd accidentally sequenced it because it was a petrous bone from what he thought was a goat or a sheep, and it turned out it was a dog. So he said, you guys want to play with this? He only told us that because it was 1:00 in the morning at a party in a conference. And this is what I mean about the kind of social element to it. And we were like, yeah, we'll have a go with that. So then Laurent builds a tree, and then we see this tree, and we're looking at the tips of the tree. We're trying to work out what is the closest related population of dogs to this ancient dog, this Neolithic dog that we had from Ireland that Dan gave us. And then my eyes just drifted to the base of the tree, and I saw that there was this number 100, and it seemed to split out. On the top was a whole bunch of dogs from the west, and on the bottom was a whole bunch of dogs from the east. And I was like, wait. Are you saying that there is a huge amount of posterior probability Bayesian support for a deep split within Eurasian dogs that necessarily splits out 2 populations, one in the east and one in the west? And he was like, yeah, that's what it's looking like. I was like, that's real? That's not an artifact of the way in which we built the tree or anything else? He's like, no, I think that's probably pretty real. And then there was this silence, there was this pause, and he kind of goes, do you think we should hang the paper on yet? I was like, hell yeah, we should hang the paper on that. My God, that's amazing. Nobody had ever seen that before. And it took us both sitting there looking at the raw data to perceive what was happening with this. And so what that means, we're still not entirely sure, but at least it's an observation that nobody had ever had before, predicated upon a data set that we got accidentally because of a drunken night in a pub from a colleague, and then Laurent, who built the tree and then compared it to everything else. And it was like, whoosh. So it was a really neat moment where all of these accidents and fun people things came together for an insight that we're working on right now. And it's still really, really exciting.
So what I'm taking from this is that you're saying we should socialize more, we should go out more, and maybe have 1 or 2 classes of whatever.
Yeah, 1 or 2 is probably good. When it gets to 5 or 6, things get a little bit more interesting. Although this was after like noted. 5 or 6, but I think you're absolutely right, and it's interesting to me because so many stories of my colleagues happened through this social interaction, and yet you see a lot of departmental administrators limiting social space within departmental. It's like everybody gets an office but there's no kind of shared space because that could be in somebody else's office. It's perceived as inefficient. When for me, it's the social space or conferences that say we have to have a talk from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and no space in between, like 20 minutes for lunch and a coffee. No. I was at a conference recently where they only had 3 talks max, and it was at least as much time for coffee and breaks as there were for talks. And it's so much better because you get the talks and you get to see what people are doing, and that's important. But then you get the social space to be able to discuss it all. And that's where everything happens. That's why COVID killed us all for this reason. And I've got no collaborations during COVID when it was all on Zoom. It's only through human interaction face to face.
Yeah, the projects and the ideas are actually happening during the breaks, right? Exactly,
always.
Okay, I would love to end on that positive note, but I want to ask you, where can people find you online?
So I was on what was called Twitter is now X, but now I'm gone because just can't stomach it. It's just no. So we're transitioning to something else. We do have a website, paleobarn.com, Palaeo, the English spelling, .com, and that's also transitioning a little bit, but that URL should remain constant. And you can find, every time we get a paper out, we put it straight up. So all of our whole back record of everything from the lab and little bits about us are on there too. So.
Gregor, thank you so much for sitting down with us for the HEAS podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.